So, good evening, everyone. There. So, hi, everyone. So, greetings from the Philosophy of Photography Club. My name is Antonni Cuesta. Tonight, our session will center on Daniel Rubinstein's What is 21st Century Photography? We are delighted to have you with us this evening. We would like to recognize the photograph used for the cover image in the club's communications. This photo has been duly licensed by Mr. Christian Babista. We thank Mr. Babista for letting us use this image for the project. Before we begin, a few reminders. This session will be recorded via Zoom. You will be prompted by Zoom to provide your consent to the recording. We thank Red Dot Community PH for hosting this event. So you might have received an email from Red Dot Community PH. So they're hosting our online event tonight. The session will also be streamed live on Facebook and Instagram. The recording will be uploaded to our partner Photography Chismis PH and its platforms, including but not limited to Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify for educational purposes, with the aim of contributing to the discourse of photography in the Philippines. Number 4, any knowledge derived from this program should be properly cited in accordance with the applicable intellectual property laws and conventions in the Philippines. Number 5, kindly keep your microphones muted. During the presentation, a moderated question and answer session will follow in the latter part of the program. Okay, number 6, fair use policy. This online event is conducted for educational use, not for profit, and is distributed free of charge under sections 184 and 185 of the Intellectual Property Code of the Philippines, Republic Act number 8293 of 1997. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research. Efforts have been made to cite all sources. To start with, may we invite Dr. Remmon Barbaza, one of our founders, for an opening remark.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Just to check once again, my audio is okay for everyone to hear. Okay, good. Thank you. So from where I am and from I suppose from where most of us are good evening. But Steph is in Munich right now. So it's -7, -7 hours.
Yeah.
Okay, so good morning to Guten Morgen. And I don't know what are the time zones of others who might be here joining us. I know someone supposedly from Mexico, all the way from Mexico City, but I don't see her name right now. So we are in different time zones. So once again, welcome to everyone, and thank you for taking the time. This is not perhaps not the best day to engage in a discussion on a Sunday. We usually have our Sundays for our families, but I suppose those who are here believe that this topic is important for you to set aside some time to be with us. So once again, good evening, and I look forward to our discussion. It's just a laid back and informal, and for just to start this series. So thank you once again, Tony. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Barbaza. So now to introduce ourselves, just a brief description of what this project is. The Philosophy of Photography Club is a small reading and discussion group that explores photography as a multifaceted field. Its discussions dwell on a range of discursive contexts, including the historical, political, cultural, scientific, and critical matrix of ideas, practices, and techniques that shape photography as a complex form. You can read more about our project in our concept paper here. For ease, you can scan the QR code to visit the same page. Also, a side note, scanning a QR code, at least in the context of the Philosophy of Photography Club, can be considered as photography, both in the technomechanical sense as well as in the data economy sense. Okay, to give a brief background on the article that we're going to discuss for tonight. This essay was commissioned by the Photographers Gallery in London and first published online in 2015. It examines how photography has been reshaped by digital technologies, networks, and algorithmic systems. Rather than focusing solely on visual representation, through prints or mechanical cameras, Rubinstein argues that contemporary photography should be understood in terms of data, computation, and distribution in an age dominated by screens and digital infrastructures. The essay situates the shift from industrial to information age conditions and challenges traditional notions of representation that defined 20th century photography. Okay, just a little of background about the author. Dr. Daniel Rubinstein is a scholar working at the intersection of philosophy, visual culture, and photography. At the time of publication, he was reader in philosophy and the image and led the MA photography program at Central St. Martin's University of Arts, London, and served as editor of the journal Philosophy of Photography. His work explores how photographic images function in a digital and networked world. Rubinstein has published books and edited volumes, including How Photography Changed Philosophy and Fragmentation of the Photographic Image in the Digital Age. Also, as mentioned tangentially, there is a journal called Philosophy of Photography, which has been running in the UK since 2010. Daniel Rubinstein was an editor of this journal. So the idea for the club is not entirely new. Although we have to admit that while maintaining the nomenclature, meaning calling it philosophy of photography, the club imagines itself to be more accessible than a purely academic exercise, as mentioned by Doc Barbaza. Maybe it's going to be a bit more laid back as compared to an academic conference or a classroom discussion. I think during the discussion of the founders, we also imagine the project as something similar to public philosophy. I think we have guests who are teachers and academics. So you can check this journal in the UK. Yeah, I think very interesting that for this club, it's a few of the clubs that I know that sends out a study guide that would signal that we're doing it as an experiment, but also put in a little bit of rigor in the exercise. To start our discussion, we believe it is just appropriate to situate what we are doing tonight in relation to the world at large. If I could use the phrase provisionally, alas, the world burns, people are dying, and society is in disarray, especially with the world news in the last 24 hours. And yet, we ask in this club, what is photography?
Uh, okay, I'll start first. I'm definitely Tumampos for everyone in this room. I am currently working here in Germany as a bid manager for an Earth observation company. And if you would think why I'm here, it's because I have been in photojournalist in the Philippines for almost a decade before I moved here to go back to my scientific roots as a physicist and as a remote sensing scientist, which also deals with a lot of images around the world. And this will be more or less discussed in my own, say, Zoom discussion later mid-year, or I think if it was scheduled around April or May. However, that question by Sir Tony that talks about what is photography and in the concept of, for example, the world burns, and if the world is really burning, so what does photography have to do with it? So for me, at least in a scientific, in a realistic sense, because I deal with images in a realistic sense and get information from those images. These images are from satellites. So I think if the world burns, then um, in that context, photography should stop being, or it stops being abstract. Like it feels like already an urgency that we have to act on it. Like photography is a witness, it's like a warning, you know? So somehow it's photography could also be used as a weapon. So, for example, when in a scientific sense, I'll speak like this na lang in a scientific sense. When we take photos, for example, of a forest burning from space, so of course we take images and we record the smoke. So it's already a warning that there's already burning from the ground, and that means that if we see smoke from images from space, of course, those images are given to us. But when we see smoke and we see it's a forest, you know that there's an urgency to act on it, to that photo is already an information and sort of a warning that, hey, there is already burning and you should inform people that because there's a forest around it, that's fuel for more burning. Or say, for example, let's just say politically what's happening now, you know, and if I might share, there is a component of satellites that are going around the world, of course, on Earth, and they activate when there's emergency. And sometimes um, they're, for example, in the European sense, they have the Copernicus program. So it's a group of satellites. And then if there's an urgency that, for example, say when Ukraine's war hit, they had to turn off their supply of images because it can be used as a weapon. You know why? Because Copernicus is a system of satellites that provide free imagery for everyone. So if you have, say, for example, specific imagery of the ground of Ukraine that can be used by other forces, it can be used as a weapon for them. Like they can attack places that they want to attack. So those kind of things. So I think in a way, in that context, what Sir Tony mentioned, photography is already like yes, it's a witness, it's a warning, it could be used as a weapon. It can be interpreted that way, at least even on the scientific perspective, and a scientist myself. So so it's just it's not just showing the world, but somehow it moves through networks and shapes it, you know. They should it's interconnected in many ways to different contexts.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Steph. Well, thank you once again to Tony for Tony's very good at organizing things like this and bringing in a scientist and a useless philosopher like me to, to come together to this gathering. But of course, we'd like to hear more also from those who are present. But where I'm coming from, maybe a little also intro, even though maybe some of you have already read. So just to give an idea where I'm coming from. So I teach philosophy at the university. I worked on Heidegger for my Ph.D. in where Steph is right now in Munich. So I've been interested mainly in phenomenology, you know, and phenomenology in the sense of Heidegger, which is because a lot of thinkers have used the word phenomenology. You know, even Hegel, no, has a book, Phenomenology of the Spirit. But I'm specifically coming from a Heideggerian concept of phenomenology as the letting show. No? It's a self-showing of whatever shows. No? Like nature can show itself one way or another. You know? Our bodies also can show itself from, let's say, when a doctor looks at the body. No? So yeah, there are also images like an X-ray. You know, is an image also. No? But let's say a painting of a nude human being is also an image of the body. But those are two different ways of showing. You know? So that's where I'm coming from. You know? And I'm in my notes. I'm really interested in these two questions. What do we do when we take photographs? It might sound like an elementary question, but I'm when we engage, when we spend time taking photographs, what is it really that is taking place? No? For us as human beings who do these activities, who engage in these activities. And by that, I also mean what takes place, what happens to us when we do it. And conversely, also, I'm also interested in the question, what do we do when we, if I can use the word, consume photographs. Like maybe we can say maybe it certainly sounds like capitalistic, like consumption. We consume images. When we scroll through, let's say, Instagram pictures or in Facebook, then it's a kind of a consumption, right? So I'm interested also in the question: what happens to us when we engage in photography, in the making of images, but also in the receiving of them, or as I've said, maybe in consuming them. Yeah, so maybe that's where I can begin for now. But maybe lest I forget, I think we should also recognize the passing away of one of our great photojournalists, Alex Baluyo, who just passed away. I never met him personally. I don't know, Tony or Steph, whether you or anyone here in this room, but I know him only by through indirectly through my connections. I had a former student who is a nephew of Alex, and I've heard stories, and also, of course, from photographers online, and they're paying homage to Alex. So yeah, so I think it's also a good opportunity for us. Now, as Tony said, now that the world is burning within the last 24 hours, and we're still enwrapped with the proceedings in The Hague, where photographs will mean a lot, right, in terms of evidence, right? But also someone like Alex Baluyo, who really dedicated his life in the work of photography, but and more in the sense of journalism. I think one of his first major works was a documentary on the NPA, right? Yeah, so maybe I'll that will be for now. No? Thank you.
So maybe it's a strange case for me because I have a lot of areas of interest when it comes to photography. So I think some of the audiences here would know me from school. Some would know me from Red Dot. Some would know me from Photography Chismes. And now we started a new project, an experiment, the philosophy of photography. For me, how is it related to what we're doing? It's very interesting that Steph mentioned that if we are to assume, or if we accept the proposition that the world is burning, and I think that's the general sense that we're getting right now, especially in the last 24 hours, specifically for satellite images that's used to track, and also that's used for surveillance. For example, when you go to the Ukraine-Russia war, most of the images used in the field are photographic. And it's interesting that when you think of photography there's also heat sensing, there's also infrared. So it's a way to detect an enemy. That's one of the real world, some of the maybe dark uses of photography, in the sense that in some circles we talk about photography as a way to express ourselves. And yet, especially in the context of war, photography is a way to detect an enemy and also to hurt an enemy. So if I'm going to use, for example, Marshall McLuhan, so it's an extension, it's a prosthesis of vision. So we can extend our human facilities to see beyond what we can see. My training is in communication arts. So I guess ako yung namamangka sa dalawang ilog, that I have interest in the more abstract theoretical discussions of photography. But as a communication practitioner, I also know that sometimes there's a tension between that. Sometimes photography is very urgent. Photography is so tactile. Photography is so piercing. It's piercing, it's wounding. That's one. And maybe, well, I have the advantage of being the host. So this is an example. So I think this is an interesting case, that space, that opening for a discussion of photography. So when you see this photo, it's a photograph taken by Noel Celis. And you will see here, so somehow the photographs here work like it's a keepsake, but it's also some sort of a talisman, a reminder. So that's an interesting aspect on how people engage with photography. So kadalasan we think of photography as an expression. Here it's a keepsake. So Nanette Castillo has a photo of her son, tapos naging para siyang amulet, no? So also when you think of an amulet, it's not necessarily physics. It's something to do with a belief. So now you're in that space that you have a physical image. It's a keepsake, but you're also in that space of remembering, but also parang talisman. At the opposite side of the spectrum, we have this. So I think you've seen pictures of this, no? I think it's very creative also for the editor of Inquirer to match the headline. So ICC prosecute Rodrigo Duterte created bloodthirsty clones. And then when you go to the photo, so this is the comms person talking, no? So there's a word clone. And then when you go to the photo, you have the supporters of former President Duterte having a life-size photo. So for me, this is something very frustrating because sometimes I feel like I cannot put a moral value to a photograph in the sense that in this case, some of us would feel differently looking at this photo as compared to the one who's remembering her son. And yet the photo works very similarly. It reminds it's somehow it's a talisman. An engagement with a wishful thinking that, for example, sa case ng mother, she's looking for justice. In this case, they're also looking for justice. Yun yung very ambiguous about photography. That's interesting for me. So, and lastly siguro, yung idea of photography being a way to narrate or a vehicle for a narrative, especially in politics wherein you put a label of good and evil. And similar to what I showed, parang somehow people would label one photo evil. Parang ang weird for me to put a value right away. Isn't photography working the same way in both cases? I think that's a good opening for the three of us now. So we're providing very broad stroke reading of photography coming from where we dwell. It's coming from where we are. So we meet photography where we are. From there, to allow also our audiences to enter with us into photography, maybe I'll ask this question also, no? How are philosophical views of photography different from something popular like in a camera club? Or perhaps something very specific to a discipline like scientific applications of photography?
I can say a statement or two. So what I see is that if it's like in a photography club, it's like an art form, right? It's a craft. So you have, like, for example, there's more focus on the thought, the theme, for example, the composition. However, for example, in scientific photography, it's more of a measurement tool. You know, the images, for example, in satellite imagery, when you get them, when I receive them, it's more of like, okay, this is the image, but then the image has a layer of information, and those layer of information is for me to interpret. So what is the use of that information? For example, are there more in that specific tile? We call it tiles. So 20 by 20 kilometers yung isang tile, for example. We see if there's more, say, vegetation. So, those kind of stuff. So it's more of a measurement tool, like, or a recording of data. But yeah, it's let's just say there's more emphasis on skill, creativity, visual impact, and in a photography club. But for a scientific kind of interpretation or scientific photography, it's more of evidence and information, factual. We want facts there, and also kind of precision, not entirely expression. And I guess just to go back on your first, in your opening statement, Sir Tony, it's where photography is very vulnerable. You know, not that it's weak. It's actually more of exposing itself, vulnerable to interpretation, vulnerable to what else? Material as well. And, like, for example, it can be also like what you showed earlier, political vulnerability. So it can have good and bad interpretations as well. So I guess that's my that's my um that's how I see the difference between, say, art club, which I wouldn't say I was part of it, but of course I was part of the photojournalism community before, and now I'm back to science. And it's there's I wouldn't say a stark difference, but there is definitely a difference on how we use our own images in science and images, say, for example, in photography, in art. So I mean, just to extend a little, because I'm always talking about satellite imaging. Of course, say images in X-rays like mammogram. It's sort of to of course to do measurements. You know, if you have a tumor, for example, it's more factual. So ayun.
I usually use this as an example in some of our talks just to provide a certain distance to what we've been used to. For example, I'm also part of a camera club, the different readings of photography. An example is an X-ray, nabanggit na ni Steph, no? We think of X-ray as a diagnostic tool. A lot of people would see this as something scientific, or it's a scientific use of photography, or it's used in support of the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, you test it, and then you have a conclusion. But interestingly, the same material, the same X-ray, when you put it inside a gallery, somehow nagkakaroon na siya ng ibang meaning. I really like yung example ng X-ray because there's something I think poetic about it. You're not necessarily reading it artistically, but it represents how photography has become a modern view of health. Ano bang ginagawa mo sa X-ray? You're looking for a malady. And also, when you look at an X-ray, it also shapes your view of what is health or the state of being healthy. Pag mayroong malady dun sa X-ray, then you're not healthy. Pero pag wala ka nakita, healthy ka. It's interesting that we think of health in visual terms when you look at a X-ray. Interesting din yung X-ray for me because the value of an X-ray gets consummated when you find something problematic in the X-ray. So if you don't see any problem, if a doctor doesn't see any problem sa X-ray, then okay, parang dismiss, 'di ba? You throw it away. But then when you look at an X-ray, then you find something wrong, like a mass or a cloudy lung, then somehow that photograph assumes its value by showing you something wrong. Very poetic siya. In a different register, if you put an X-ray sa gallery, it opens up different meanings also. Imagine this: if you have an X-ray in a gallery, parang people will ask, what is it about? That's what frustrates me about photography sometimes. Ang hirap magkaroon ng stand minsan about sa photography. For example, sa X-ray. So I can say na an X-ray is moral, but it's not neutral. When you think of the first Nobel Prize for physics was given to Röntgen, the one who discovered X-rays. So the first Nobel Prize was for photography. Parang if you phrase it a different way, the first Nobel Prize for physics was about photography or for a photograph, which is through an X-ray, People are very excited about it. Suddenly you can see through flesh. But ironically, yung excitement about that photograph around 1992 sa Philippines, specifically sa Philippines, DOH released administrative order na dapat i-control natin siya kasi there's also hazard sa health natin. Parang ang strange lang that this kind of light has an effect to our flesh. So parang it transcends the physical and energy.
Thank you, Tony. Tony, is it possible to show on screen the text? Because I'd like to hear from the audience. I'm focusing now on the question of materiality. I think towards the end, Rubinstein brings that to the fore of the text. The paragraph that begins within this absorbing always on and everywhere at the same time. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So I'd like to ask the audience when you, if you can share with us also your sense of our connection with the materiality, of the things that we photograph and or the world around us that attracts us and makes us think, oh, maybe this is something that I could take a picture of, right? Now, there's always this world that it's not abstract, right? It's material, no? Even the light, no? Well, I'm not a physicist, but of course there's the physics behind light, right? So I'd like to focus on that, no? And when Rubinstein says within this absorbing always on and everywhere at the same time, anamateriality, the world does not come before the image, nor is it produced by the image. Rather, photography is the visual figuration of a new layer of consciousness. in which new relationships to space and time, and therefore new categories of thought, play, art, and agency are emerging. And then towards the end, he would say, the last paragraph na talaga, no? Through it, we come to understand. I'm reading at maybe the last seven lines. Now, through it, we come to understand that the real world is nothing more than so much information plucked out of chaos. No? The randomized and chaotic conflation of bits of matter, strands of DNA, subatomic particles, and computer code. In photography, one can glimpse how the accidental meetings of these forces are capable of producing temporary, meaningful assemblages that we call quote unquote images. In the 21st century, photography is not a stale sight for sore eyes, but the inquiry into what makes something an image. As such, photography is the most essential task of art in the current time. So I was struck by the last paragraphs of Rubinstein, but I wanted to focus on the question of the experience of material, of matter. Coming from philosophy, I could not help but think of all the way back more than 2,000 years ago of Plato, right? When those of you who did a bit of Plato in college, you would remember that Plato's world is dual, right? The world of ideas and the world that is sensible. The world of ideas is pure ideas, like pure forms. Right now, when we are in a way, I'm just trying to simplify it as best as I could. Right now, we are in this world that is sensible. That is to say, we can experience the world through our senses, and we are still entrapped in our bodies, which is material. It's like a prison, and when we die, our soul will hopefully reach the world of ideas, the pure forms, right? And so, for instance, when we see a beautiful tree and take a photograph of a beautiful tree, um, Plato would say that the beautiful tree is not yet beauty itself, right? It the pure idea of beauty is there in the world of ideas, right? So it's as you can, maybe you can say, one step detached from the real. Even Imelda Marcos would speak of the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? I wonder if she read Plato. So a photograph would be not a photograph of a tree is not a tree itself, right? There's a tree, and you take a photograph of the tree. So that's one step detached from the real tree. But the tree itself, as a beautiful tree, is not beauty itself, but only takes part in this, what Plato calls the pure form. So I'm sorry if this is a bit of a nosebleed, but but that's interesting, because if the photograph is one step away from the tree itself, if the photograph of a tree is one step away from the tree itself, um, what does it say now of us in the 21st century when we don't use, for instance, we don't use films anymore, right? Or only the uh, the I don't know. It's just a small group of people, or those who do photography, who still use film. For one, it's expensive, right? But at least the film, when you use the film, there is still a material connection, right? The film absorbs the light, right? And once it's absorbed by the film, then there's not much. It's already there. There's only so much you can do in darkroom in terms of editing, right? But the material, that the film itself is the it's I think, if I'm not mistaken, in the digital, the what would be parallel is the raw image, right? So So my concern is if in the time of Plato he was already concerned about being detached, no, from the experience of the real thing, as it were, no, how much more now, if Plato were alive now, right, he would be all the more disturbed by how detached we are, right, no, from the experience, and by that also is the materiality of the experience, right? So even right now we are meeting via Zoom, but we don't see we don't, right. The only materiality, I suppose, that we can have of each other is I think is the voice, right? But even well, we can up to not show ourselves for one thing, right? So that's my concern in Rubinstein, right? When he says now it's the accidental meetings of these forces, right? Meaningful assemblages of what we call images, right? Um, so I'd like to ask the audience now, when you when you engage in photography, whether as one who takes photographs or or whether as one who simply looks and maybe admires and appreciates images, and you like looking at good photographs even though without having to engage in photography itself. Now, I don't know whether the question of materiality has ever come across your mind now. So maybe that's a question I wanted to pose also to the audience. Please feel free. As I've said, this is just a little discussion, um, and more laid back than than anything. So please don't hesitate.
Doc, I have a question. Going to your idea of the Platonic distinction of the realm of ideas, there's one theorist, his name is Gilles Masson. Photography happens at the basic process of sight. So for him, his argument is ocular vision is photography. If we're going to be very strict on the technomechanical, biochemical definition of photography as light creating images on a photosensitive surface. So I'm curious on that question of materiality in the sense that vision itself phenomenologically. How do we reconcile that idea of a world detached when we go to the senses that we have? I think that's Marlo Ponti ito. Inisip ko kung if I go back to Plato, then I would be forced to make a distinction of the perfect forms as compared to the sensible. In the spectrum of defining photography, there's this one view of photography as an image, but you have this biological, evolutionary, naturalistic view of photography, at least in the human body. So for example, if I look at sabihin natin war being detached. So when you view a photograph of a massacre, you think that it's a reality detached. So sa media theory na nakahiwalay siya. But then again, I'm also trying to be very generous when in relation to photography. That, for example, some of the students I think here are some of them have interest in photojournalism. That how do they bridge that image as being detached and them being a photojournalist who's there being a witness to the things that's happening.
Yeah. We have Tony, meron tayong we have contribution from the audience here, Richelle Flores. Richelle, would you like to read, make us hear your voice? You wanna read your comment?
Hello, good evening, everyone. So I would like to comment on the idea of of materiality in the digital image.
Yeah.
Next, last semester I was teaching computer vision. So this actually a very interesting topic for me. And one of the main
Yeah.
ideas in computer vision is that the digital image is always an approximation. So allow me to read my thoughts. Perhaps as opposed to the physical film that captures light itself, the digital image is always an approximation, as digital images are always expressed in pixels. So while there is a degree of detachment in both cases, the photo captured in film versus a digital image, can be said perhaps that one method is closer to the pure form that Plato is referring to than the other. I would posit, for example, the film photo is there's a math term like continuous. It captures the continuity of reality versus if you capture a photo with say your phone, it's already compressed, it's already processed in form. Um, but on the other hand, if for example, if we're talking about beauty, the pure form of beauty, the image captured digitally could be enhanced to be closer to an idea. So that's there's a tension right there. Is the material is this relationship between materiality and pure form the actual method of capture? Is it the concepts about something along those lines?
Well, wow. Thank you. Thank you, Richel. A little trivia. Richel was a former student of mine, and it's good to see him again here. But now we are colleagues now. Richel, you're teaching with the Department of Mathematics?
Yes.
Or yeah, that's right. Yeah, okay. All right. Thank you. But what do you think, Richel, between the digital and the physical, the film photography? Are you saying that you said one method is closer to pure form, whatever we understand by that? What's your sense?
Uh, the easy way is to think of the film as the the closer thing because
The easy way.
the easy way to think about it because you're
Okay.
capturing
Yes,
the reality itself,
that's right.
right?
That's it. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
there's a direct material connection, right? The film capturing the light, right? Whereas a digital image can actually be generated even without any any contact with. Am I right? Like one can simply rearrange, right? Like AI, for instance.
so something like that. Uh, but also the thing I suddenly realize is that, for example, when we say you Photoshop an image,
That's right.
so
Yeah,
for in order for it to fit a quote unquote ideal beauty standard, for example,
exactly. Yeah.
is that bringing the image, the digital image, closer to the pure form, or
Yeah. And it offends us. Right. Yeah, that's a paradox, right? When we see, I suppose all of us have seen AI generated images of an extremely beautiful human being, right? On the one hand, we recognize, wow, this is a beautiful person, and yet we at the same time we know that it's fake, right? So, so whereas the photograph of that is not AI generated is more beautiful, right? With it, and even without the manipulation of the image, even when we think of what do you call this, a plastic surgery, for instance, right? People who grow old gracefully, right? As opposed to people who have interventions, clinical medical interventions to approximate an idea of the form beauty, and all the more they appear as grotesque and even ugly, right? Despite the expenses. So yeah.
I want to add on that, Sir Remmon, so,
Yeah,
because I
sure.
heard
Please. Yeah.
Rachel mention about computer vision and somehow in my area as well in terms of remote sensing. So I think in this context about Rubinstein's, article, I think he argues that um, the way I see it is like photography becomes less about a fixed, tangible thing and more of like, a network of operations. So basically what it means is that I think what I get from Rubinstein is that film is like a trace, there's presence in that versus say a digital image, for example, is like a simulation, like endlessly being able to be viewed, and also the approximation. I mean, that it is also an approximation of a reality, because it's basically all about pixels, and there's also a side what Rubinstein has been arguing, that there's a network of operations behind it before you get to the final like image of it. So I think that's where um the argument is, and also about like, for example, in film and in digital, in terms of materiality and say immateriality, uh the film will always it exists physically, and also, however, it can also be damaged. But in digital, the only way, there's even if it gets damaged digitally, you can even reconstruct it. So somehow, I guess, in terms of, especially now with AI, I guess this is where trustworthiness comes in. I hope I'm for sure this one, trustworthiness in AI, that is there. Let's just say film was pretty truthful. It's so hard to, like, there, of course, there were techniques how to play around film, like how truthful is, say, you overlay films together, and then there's already a new image formed from that reality. But definitely digital is not, I wouldn't say it's not, digital is not purely deceptive unless it's like generated, but both systems are kind of mediated. So they're still like, uh I think the question for me, at least here, is that does photography kind of still need, especially here in 21st century, going back to Rubinstein's conversation, is that does photography still need reality for us to function? Because like the medium that we have right now in terms of materials is that we have mirrorless digital SLRs, and they're like, they have chips, they can process the fil the that an the ocular image, and then process it into an image that is already, as what you say, all about pixels, and it can be processed as well. So I think that's I guess that's my contribution to this conversation, at least when I heard the pixel, and that you're working on that field as well. It really lights me up that someone, at least in structure, let's just say a definitive form of science, in terms of like science, like computer science, mathematics, is here in this audience. So yeah, I think that's just one of my kind of, I wouldn't say 2 cents, maybe 1 cent of this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.
We have a message from Vlad Bumatay.
Yeah. Yeah, Vlad, would you want to share with us your thought? Maybe you can read your message if that's okay.
Yeah, yeah, thanks. I'll just read my message. But sometimes I think, if not most of the time, photography is not about the object photographed. A photograph of a tree is not simply about the tree. Sometimes the object photograph serves merely as a worldly anchor for something else that may not even be worldly possible, but which one can approximate through the act of picture taking and the image produced. So, in a sense, photography brings one closer to the reality one wants to latch on. So, I suppose Plato's concern is only disturbing to those primarily concerned about the worldly and the possible. So, I'm not so much disturbed by Plato. Uh, So, in my case, for example, I photograph my grandparents because I want them to live forever, but alas, there's no forever. It's not a worldly possibility. So, photography instead brings me closer to that reality.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vlad. I think that's beautifully said. No, Tony, if I may, if I can respond to that right now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Maybe just to, but before responding to Vlad and to Richelle, actually, maybe just to clarify my position. Actually, the philosopher I worked on, Heidegger, is anti-Plato. And I remember my mentor in Munich telling me, if there's one philosopher that Heidegger hated the most, it's Plato. um, um, maybe just to simplify, as I've said, in Plato, there's the split world of the ideal and the sensible, no? And for Heidegger, you cannot separate the material, no, from whatever it is that makes, let's say, what makes a human being a human being. You cannot separate the humanity of that human being from the tenor of his voice, the feel of the skin or whatever, you cannot separate it, no? Or if you look at the sculpture of David, of Michelangelo, the marble belongs as much to the work of art. Now you can't separate, no? So and also, just to clarify, maybe to clarify my position, I am not of the position that let's say film is better than digital, right? I well, for instance, if we include painting, for instance, what is Picasso's Guernica, for instance, his depiction of war is abstract, right? And you compare it to a photograph of a war that's done by, let's say, American propagandists, then I would say that Picasso would be closer to the truth of the horrors of war, even though it's just abstract and painting. It's not even light, or a film capturing light, right? Or let's say a painting of a nude person using pigments, as compared to, let's say, in the time when pornography was being done through film, right? So it, yeah, I suppose you're getting my point, right? So it's not necessarily film is better than digital, right? Or sometimes even a digital image can say more about the truth of the human being than a photograph with material connection by virtue of the use of the film. So yeah, just to clarify where I'm coming from now. But I like what Vlad was saying, that in a photograph of a tree is not simply about the tree, yeah. Which brings me to another concern of mine, that to answer my question, I suppose, what do we do when we take photographs? I think every photograph is a saying, right? In every We take photographs because we want to say something. Right, right. Whether it's a grief, whether it's a wonder about beauty, whether it's question, whether it's an objection to, let's say, war. We take a photograph of a war, for instance, in a way that elicits a response of a protest to violence. Then that's so, to me, every photograph is a saying. There is always an utterance behind a photograph. We want to say something, and we want to be heard, right? And an image is one way of I think, saying that. Which necessarily brings us to the question of course, truth, right? Which is a big, big word and a big concept, right? In the age of fake news, in the age of artificially generated images, etc., etc. What are we saying? What utterances are we making? What are we telling other people? No? Is there even a genuine conversation going on, when we say something by way of a photograph? Maybe just one last for this, at least for this point. I can't help but recall the poet Gerald Manley Hopkins. Now, one of his lines says, Selves goes itself, myself it speaks and spells. Crying what I do is me. I say more. So myself it speaks and spells. So whether it is by way of music, by way of photography, by way of even sports, whatever human endeavor, I think, and what we do, we speak about ourselves, and we say something. And so my concern about photography now is what are we communicating when we photograph? But even before that, I think we can only begin to communicate when we have ourselves experience something being communicated to us beforehand, right? Right? Before we take a photograph, a scene has struck us, right? Nauna eh, the scene first spoke to us, and we're moved by a scene, and we're so moved that we want to take a photograph of it. No. That's why I think it's not so much capturing a scene, but allowing ourselves to be captured by the moment, right? Now, and that comes first, right? A moment, an event speaks to us, and we're so moved by it that we want to share that also to others, right now. And so one last nano, so we can hear also from the others, that I always return to Jeremiah Hopkins' poem, Spring and Fall to a Young Child. This very short poem, this young girl Margaret standing before a forest of trees, and she sees maybe 9 years old, 8 years old Margaret. She sees leaves falling and she's crying. And the persona says, Margaret, are you grieving? Why? You're so young. You're too young to be to be depressed by the sight of falling trees. And yet there she is standing before these trees with leaves falling. And then at the end of the poem it says, it is Margaret you mourn for. So this young Margaret, without a camera, without even writing about it, but just standing in front of these trees with leaves falling, and she allowed the moment to speak to herself, right? And I think we can only say something when we first listen. Yeah, and I think that's just the same with photography. We cannot show unless we have been captured by a scene, by whatever it is that takes place before us, right? No, so it's always just a response, no, to something that spoke to us first, no. So yeah, that's what my concern about photography when it comes to materiality also is in a way anti-Plato, in the sense that you can't separate we can't intellectualize a scene, but we always go back to the material, the voice, the sound, the color, the intensity of even temperature, etc., etc. And the photograph is just an approximation of that moment, that where some truth takes place. No? Yeah. Thank you. No.
This is what's interesting about philosophy of photography. There's so many registers where we can dwell in communications. We would usually use, we have Marshall McLuhan, you have Latour. There are so many places where we can start moving into photography. I think that the prepositions also helps us find the nuances. If I was not a photographer, I would say I feel like that photography is a foreclosure. I remember the first podcast that we had, Doc Raymond. For me, I didn't understand what phenomenology is in relation to photography, because my training was, I was very critical about how all photographs are just signs from a semiotics perspective. Everything is a sign. So in a way, everything, whether it's a drawing, whether it's sound, everything is a step detached. But then again, you'd go to Derrida, sabi, hindi, there's no outside text. So, yun yung interesting with photography, that you can bring in a thinker and You can explore photography using the tools that he proposes. To be honest, from the training that I had before, very critical ako about photography. Now, I have to let what shows itself be seen from itself as it shows itself from itself. For the last 2 years, since the first time that we had a podcast, that line has been disturbing me. How do you let what shows itself be seen from itself as it shows itself from itself? And that's parang very different from how I was trained. Like yung training pag communication school, you look at a photograph and then you analyze. It's very analytical, very very propositional. So now I find myself during classes, during theory classes, that sometimes I have to shift language. So sometimes I have to quote unquote deconstruct. But then again, siya kasi iba naman yung sinasabi din ni Heidegger. But parang nangyayari yung exegesis of a photograph or siguro a visual exegesis or yung hermeneutics ng image. Parang sometimes I have to be aware whether I'm speaking in an analytical manner or am I approaching it in a very letting way. Going back to Rubinstein's text. I think yun yung difference of the 20th century photography na the modernistic way of looking at photography is it's a foreclosure. I'm inventing words then. So it's a foreclosure because every time you frame, you extract in the article that we wrote about the philosophy of photography. If you think of photography as a foreclosure or gestell, somehow very near yung language of inframing with extraction. And I think some theorists works around that idea of inframing, that you think of everything as a resource to be captured. Everything becomes standing reserve. Everything is just part of a stockpile of discrete and indiscrete objects. Going back to Rubinstein, I think that what struck me is that very lofty or very very positive yung line na Enlightenment ideals of thinking that photography is a way for us to emerge from this self-incurred immaturity. So interesting, 1784, 50 years after Nipse invented the heliograph around 1826. So 50 years after this line, Nipse invented the heliograph, the first photograph. For me, the fact that we can imprint reality, or well, very very troublesome yung word na reality when we do philosophy. I think yun din yung one of the challenge here is that we're trying to do public philosophy. Siguro things get lost in translation. For example, if this was my theory class, for one session, we will just work on one thinker or one article. Tapos we bracket the others for a moment. Then in a different session, we talk about another. You can tailor fit the language based on the conversation. For me, specifically for Rubinstein, I think yung one main difference of 20th century photography as compared to the 21st is that there's an assumption that 20th century photography is rational. I understand yung attraction of that idea of materiality, which is basically still very rational. You can prove it. There's quote unquote physical materiality. But when you go to 21st century photography, everything is a simulation. Well, not everything. It becomes information. It becomes bytes. It becomes pixels. It becomes binary 010. For me, at least, how do we distinguish 20th century photography with 21st century photography? One of my answers is that yes, yung materiality is one very critical aspect, but only insofar as you make a distinction about the physical and the simulation. For me, I make a distinction siguro na 20th century photography is rational. Rational meaning part of it is industrial, part of it is mechanical, part of it is there's an assumption that it's adequate. The classic way of training photographers is that a photograph has to be adequate to correspond to the report that you're doing, at least in terms of photojournalism and documentary. Yun yung classical training that the photograph has to be truthful. May question of adequacy when you take a photograph as compared to when it gets read or seen by others. Is it adequate enough the way that you captured or you foreclosed the message? And then when you disclose it to others, is it adequate? Is it the same or is it sufficient? Pero yung sa 21st century photography, it goes beyond discrete claims. It goes beyond discrete claims of what is true or false. It goes beyond materiality. If a very meaningful image, whether it's simulated or not, do you really make a distinction on what is disclosed to you? Kasi if it's disclosed to you, parang you can't do anything about it. It's disclosed to you. Na material na siya. I think lalo na as we move in the next siguro 3 to 5 years, that faculty of us, yung visual literacy natin, to make a distinction of what is AI and not, what is simulated and what is quote unquote real, it gets blurred, and we are left in the mercy of images. For me, yung 21st century photography, yun yung opening. So I won't assign a bad or a good yet. But to a certain extent, we are in the mercy of images. The boundary of what is a photogram becomes very fuzzy. Kasi nga, fuzzy logic na eh. Kung sa Fury language, hindi na siya indexical. Or in a few years, what is indexical? I have a co-faculty who says that if it can hurt you, if I can bruise you, that's indexical. And that's 21st century photography na we are left in the mercy of images. 20th century photography, somehow meron pang distinction of the analog of reality. Yun din yung entry point dun sa question of what distinguishes film photography at that silver halides reacting to light. But then again, now you don't have that anymore. 21st century photography is we are left in the mercy of simulation. Interesting sa claim ni Rubinstein. We think of photography as discrete objects and bodies. When you go to 21st century photography, there's no more discrete objects. Parang it's a very Latourian kind of view of ontology. There's no distinction. There's no more privileging of human bodies or objects like mathematics. Everything is a simulation. And if you are born, especially in that kind of society, you are always already in that reality. How you deal with it, we're still going to find out. When you go to 21st century photography, we're not talking about images anymore.
Siguro I want to throw in my thoughts on this, because true, it can be, there's a lot of ambiguity kasi. So like um we speak of like already kind of with a little conviction that photography is kind of I would say paano ba, death of a photograph or something like that, that there's no part already. But let's look back into a little scientific thought of what is a photograph. It's composed of light. It's because of light, you know. And there's um sure there is the component of systems, but when you take a photograph, it still will involve light as much as possible. Any kind of light, you cannot make a photograph without light itself. So there's still, I would say, realness to it. But then in terms of what AI is having, I mean, it's proposing right now in this say uh say the composition of images, say something like that, that will be surrounded with three systems, and we can compose image anytime. But where do these images come from? It still comes from, real images, and they stack it all together. And I think that's also like just also saying that, okay, uh I think with Rubinstein, he kind of, I wouldn't say explicitly mentioned, but he also describes as image operating autonomously. Like, when you take a photo, that's already it. But and like there's already sorting, predicting, surveilling, like these kind of, these kind of thoughts. But I think an image does not act alone. You know, like quote unquote, it's not acting alone. Like, for example, when you speak of, say, ChatGPT, for example, so tangential from away from photography, but you still ask ChatGPT what to do, and it just you know gets information from everywhere, and it puts it together. Those information, it can be valuable, it can be just bullshit, for the lack of term. But also, I just, like, I think in the general sense, photograph has uh has survived the test of time, as you say, something like that. When the moving images or the movies was invented, or somehow kind of developed, it kind of, we were already saying that, oh, it's the death of a photograph, or like like it will stop, but then it's still emerged that it's still a a good medium to say to portray something or to get a fraction of reality. And now we're already here, digital autonomous 21st century photography. I think we forget that um there's everyday context, like from people, from photographers, from institutions. And I would say that in my field, in remote sensing, we use satellite imagery, and they are autonomous. They continue to take photos around the world. Like, let's say, one satellite takes photos of the same almost exact place every 5 days. So that's why we have real real-time image every 3 to 5 days, for example, in a specific location. But still, it's because there was an act behind it that says this is the amount of time that the amount of images that you can take, or the time frame that you can take an image of the specific location, because this is our interest. This is what I'm interested on. So I don't know if my message makes sense, but I guess I think, moving forward to the next agenda, I guess, of this conversation, where does Rubinstein fail in his argument? You know, so I think in terms of the technology, even itself, the determination towards having um, our relationship towards material is always definitive of our choices. So that's why we have technological development, because we want something better. We want something to capture that will not decay, for example, for film. But we also choose film even right now sometimes because we love the feel of it, and also the way we store it. And sometimes film can be stored, their images can be stored digitally because we want continuity, in a sense, to open it endlessly, to use it endlessly. So
Vlad has a interesting take also. He introduces yung instrumental reason. Vlad, would you like to expound or share yung tinipe mo?
Yeah, this is just an expression of I don't know, objection to Rubinstein. I find him to be too cynical in the essay. That's why I'm saying that assuming photography is really driven by instrumental reason, so I don't know, rationality, scientific reason, the things that you mentioned. This does not mean that one cannot be in an ethical relationship with your subject. Uh, so I use a taxi driver as a means to allow me to travel, but this is not in itself wrong. So instrumental reason is actually involved in everyday life, and much of our dealings with other people involve using them as some sort of means. So my sense is that using someone as a means is not in itself wrong, and does not itself expunge you from developing an ethical relationship with that. So what is problematic is using someone as a mere means. I think Kant tells us this, the idea that we shouldn't use someone merely as a means. But he did not say that we cannot use someone as a means. The emphasis there is the mere means. It does not bother me then that instrumental reason is involved. So yeah, you can view your subject as some sort of a resource, or as I said, an anchor. But again, that in itself is not wrong, so long as your photographic practice is still constrained by ethical considerations. So I'm thinking of, we can collaborate with your subject. You can co-produce with your subject when you're taking the photograph, a portrait, for example. If you're making a book, or ethical presentation and distribution, I think this is where the materiality also becomes important. But instrumental reason by itself is not the problem, I submit. So Rubinstein is too cynical. But I agree that the use of instrumental reason at least require us to confront our photographic practices and make them more ethical. So the solution is not to, I don't know, do away with the instrumental reason component of photography. I don't think we can do away with the instrumental reason part, but to add ethical considerations in that particular usage of instrumental reason.
Vlad brings up a very good point, introducing ethics in the discussion. Ako personally, when I read Rubinstein, the weight of the article for me was more of its descriptive power, less of the. Well, I understand that we went into ethics because of uh we had a while of the being a way to foreclose possibilities. Well, that's the language that I use. I think tama there's a sense of cynicism on Rubinstein's part. For me, I think yung kay Rubinstein, he was just focusing on the description of what makes it different without necessarily pointing out a specific moral or ethical stand. Well, that's just me. So I do not know about the rest. For me, I think yung strength ng article was on its power to describe what has changed in the last 200 years, but also coming from Enlightenment that would include an additional 50 to 100 years. So yung late Enlightenment.
Yeah. Yeah, I think Vlad, we have to thank Vlad for giving us a good suggestion for the next topic for our next round of photography and ethics. So I'm sure we cannot begin to discuss, but that's a very, very important topic. I think, for instance, in street photography, if consent of people in public spaces are necessary, then a lot of the greatest photographs since, like for instance, the Martin Parr would not have come to be, if that were the case. So, but it's a controversial, it's a contested topic, but it's a very important topic, and so we thank Vlad for bringing that up. But I think Tony and Steph, when we were discussing about this series, so we said I think we should aim for an hour and a half. Would be a good time to wrap things up.
So, again, we thank everyone for your presence for tonight. To close our activity, may we ask our co-founder, Stephanie Tumampos, for the closing.
Thank you, Sir Tony and Sir Remmon. Especially thank you to all who came here to our event, our inaugural event about philosophy of photography. And this is such a fun conversation because we really had so many topics circling around from photography itself to ethics, which is, of course, what Sir Remmon mentioned is a good conversation to have in our next these sessions. So what Sir Remmon said about who gets to be photographed is very controversial here, even in Europe. If you're going to ask me, Steph, why aren't you doing street photography in Europe? It's so it is really tricky because there are some rules here in Germany even that if you're taking a photograph, it should be, if it's only a single person in your photo, then you have to delete it. If it's with a lot of people, it should be fine, but it's very tricky. There's a lot of loopholes, and that is something that's really good to discuss, I guess, Sir Rem, especially you've lived here in Munich. Maybe next time a different perspective, because here in the Philippines, it's okay to take photos of everyone. Everyone is so okay with it, but here everyone's very, very private. But in any case, this conversation about Rubinstein and is really interesting because we want to see ourselves is studying around material, and also, of course, not just material but technology evolving itself. Are we really part of the process? Or is it already autonomous by itself? So there's a lot of things to talk about, and we have further sessions on this one, monthly sessions. I think Sir Tony has already kind of predetermined the topics in our next month's conversation, and I hope you'll still be around with us in that next conversation. And thank you again. Thank you so much for your presence today. I think it really gives us, I guess, a lot of relief that there are at least 15 people who are here, 15, 14 people who are 14 people who are here listening to this conversation. And I hope next time we will be able to have more space for everyone to give their, their thoughts about this. We want more conversational discussions rather than maybe three of us talking to each other, and like just to let's encourage a more conversational community, because philosophy should be with people around, and not and there's more topics to be, uh opened, and that makes it more interesting. And yeah, see you, I guess, next month, Sir Tony, about our next topic.
Okay, with that, thank you, Steph. Thank you to everyone who joined us. We hope this discussion inspires further reflection on photography and its evolving place in our world. Everyone, good night. See you in our next meeting. Bye.
Bye.